He pulled up to the house, just doing his job. But when the police were called on him, he realized the fight wasn't just for deliveries, it was for dignity. Jalen Ross adjusted the strap on his delivery bag as he slid into the seat of his company van, the early morning sun peeking over the city skyline. The dashboard glowed with the soft hum of the navigation system guiding him toward his final destination of the day, a neighborhood called Maplewood Heights. A gated community, upper crust, and architecturally smug, where every mailbox looked like a miniature mansion, and even the squirrels probably wore bow ties. It was one of those neighborhoods where the silence wasn't peaceful, it was curated. Where wealth wasn't just present, it was loud. Driveways were lined with Teslas, BMWs, and the occasional vintage Mercedes parked like artwork. Jalen had been here before, but not often. Most deliveries here were routed to drivers with more seniority, which was code for drivers that looked the part. But today, a scheduling glitch had sent him. He wore the standard company uniform, navy blue polo shirt with the Ross Logistics logo, matching cap, and a high-visibility vest. His van was marked, his credentials official, his name tag clean. Everything about him screamed professional, yet he already felt the weight of eyes as he pulled up to the security gate. The guard station, a polished glass booth, housed a balding man with mirrored sunglasses and a clipboard that he held like it was a badge of honor. Jalen rolled down his window. "Delivery for 742 Evergreen Terrace," Jalen said, holding up his phone screen with the order details. The guard didn't respond at first, just stared. Then slowly, he checked his clipboard. "Who are you with?" "Ross Logistics," the guard squinted. "Never heard of it." Jalen raised an eyebrow. Ross Logistics wasn't a no-name outfit. It was one of the largest private shipping firms in the region. His father, Charles Ross, founded it from nothing, built it up brick by brick until it handled everything from medical supplies to boutique retail. Still, Jalen said nothing. He'd learned long ago that pushing back, even when he had every right, rarely worked out in neighborhoods like this. Finally, the guard hit a button, and the gate swung open with the slow groan of privilege. Driving through Maplewood Heights felt like navigating a museum of wealth. Manicured lawns looked photoshopped, hedges were trimmed like someone might grade them, and houses stood 3 stories tall, all glass, marble, and mood lighting. Jalen found the address quickly. 742. Evergreen Terrace was a columned colonial revival mansion, complete with a circular driveway and a lion statue that looked like it judged people for a living. Jalen parked by the curb, unbuckled his seatbelt, and climbed out. He walked up the stone path to the front door, package in hand, rang the bell, and waited. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. The woman who answered was in her mid-50s, blonde, and wearing a cashmere wrap over yoga gear. She looked like a woman who complained to managers as a hobby. "Yes?" she said, her tone so flat it could have been used to level tables. "Good morning, ma'am. I have a delivery for you. From Bose, home audio system," he added, showing her the label on the box. She didn't touch the box. Instead, her eyes darted from the package to his face, to his vest, then back to his face. "You sure that's for me?" Jalen tapped the address label. "It says 742 Evergreen Terrace. That's you, right?" A long pause. Finally, she took the box without another word, shut the door as if the conversation, and perhaps his existence, was finished. Jalen exhaled, turned on his heel, and walked back to the van. His heart rate wasn't up. He wasn't angry. Not exactly. Just tired. Tired in that bone-deep way that comes from always having to prove you're not a threat. As he climbed back into the van, he didn't notice the curtain in the house across the street twitching, or the woman with the phone angled just right to get a blurry zoomed-in shot of him walking back to his vehicle. or the words she would later use when she dialed 911. "There's a man. Yeah, he's lingering. Looks like he's casing the neighborhood." By the time Jalen pulled out of the cul-de-sac and started toward the community exit, the text came through on the officer's in-car laptop. "Suspicious male, dark clothing, possibly armed." Jalen didn't know any of this. He was tapping his delivery app, marking the drop-off as complete, and swiping over to check traffic on his next route. Then came the sirens. A patrol car. Lights flashing. Jalen's stomach dropped, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he'd done everything right. That's what made it worse. He pulled over to the side, hands resting on the steering wheel, fingers spread wide and visible. His heart thudded in his chest, slow but heavy. The officer stepped out of the car, tall, buzz-cut, hand on holster, the kind of cop who didn't look for explanations, just confirmations of his assumptions. "License, registration, step out of the vehicle." Jalen complied. No sudden moves, no sharp replies, just calm, even tones, like he'd practiced in his head 100 times. "I'm with Ross Logistics," he said. "Delivery. You can check my manifest. It's all time-stamped." "Got a call," the officer said. "Said you were acting suspicious." Jalen gave a short laugh that wasn't really a laugh. "I walked a box to a door." That's not what we heard. And yet, it's what happened. The officer looked him over again, as if trying to decode him. Another patrol car rolled up. Jalen's heart sank a little more. Jalen stood by the side of his van, hands on the hood, palms flat as the second officer approached. His heart thumped slow and heavy, but his face stayed still. He'd learned long ago that any sign of frustration, even earned frustration, could be taken as aggression, especially here, especially now. The first officer, name tag reading Wells, was digging through Jalen's credentials. Delivery manifest, license, vehicle registration, all perfectly in order. The second officer, a younger one with mirrored sunglasses and a nervous energy, kept his hand near his taser. Not his gun. Not yet. But close enough that Jalen noticed. "Mind telling me again what you're doing here?" Officer Wells asked. Jalen didn't look up. "Dropping off a package. 742 Evergreen Terrace. Bose speaker system. Signed delivery. You can call the customer if you need confirmation." Wells gave a grunt and turned back to his cruiser. Jalen could feel the younger cop's stare like a laser on his back. Not because he was dangerous, but because the cop expected him to be. The thing was, Jalen knew how this game worked. He'd been raised to survive these moments. His father, Charles Ross, yes, that Ross, had taught him more than just logistics and business. He taught him posture, tone, survival in silence. "Don't give them what they're looking for," his father once told him over breakfast when Jalen was 16 and fuming after being followed around a bookstore. "You know who you are. But sometimes the world doesn't care until you make it undeniable." Jalen hadn't planned on using this moment to prove a point, but now that it was happening, this absurd, predictable, dangerous moment, he knew exactly what was at stake. Behind him, the radio crackled in the cruiser. Officer Wells got back out. "Dispatch confirms package drop-off was logged at 9:26 a.m. Homeowner also confirmed the delivery. Says everything was fine." Jalen raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. Wells narrowed his eyes. "We still need to check your cargo. Open the back of the van." Jalen sighed inwardly. It didn't matter that everything checked out. He was still being treated like a potential threat. He stepped slowly toward the rear of the van, unlocked it, and pulled open the double doors. Boxes, neatly stacked, all with printed labels. Half were for local addresses, the rest were returns headed back to the warehouse. Wells poked through a few of them, pulling one partially open before waving the younger cop over. "Looks clean," Wells said. Jalen waited. Nothing about this felt resolved. Not yet. Then came the real twist. From down the road, a third vehicle began approaching. Black, sleek, windows tinted. It didn't belong to the neighborhood. It didn't look like a police car, but it rolled in smooth and slow, stopping just behind the patrol cruiser. The front window lowered, and there he was. Charles Ross, CEO, founder, industry giant, father, dressed down, hoodie, jeans, but still unmistakable. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the officers, then at Jaylen, then back to the officers. Wells straightened up. The younger cop suddenly looked like a kid caught throwing eggs at his teacher's car. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Charles said, stepping out of the car. "I sent my son on this route. Wanted to get some real-world exposure. Didn't expect it to turn into an incident report." Jaylen didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched as his father's presence shifted the entire mood like a weight crashing into calm water. Wells blinked. "Your son?" "Yes, Jaylen Ross. My son. Also a field auditor for Ross Logistics. Today's run was for observational assessment." He let the words hang, let them echo into the discomfort. "Oh," Wells muttered. "Didn't realize." "No, I imagine you didn't." Jaylen closed the van doors slowly, methodically. He walked over to his father. The officers watched, still trying to figure out how to exit the scene with their dignity intact. Charles looked at his son. "You okay?" Jaylen nodded. Then Charles turned to the officers. "Do you want to know why he's out here?" he asked. Wells shifted his weight. "Just making deliveries, right?" "No," Charles replied. "He's testing your neighborhood, testing how my drivers are treated in places like this. We've had reports, late packages, missing deliveries, always when the driver is black. So I sent my son." Silence. "You just confirmed everything I suspected," Charles added, his voice calm, lethal in its clarity. "Even when the paperwork is flawless, even when the delivery is confirmed, your first response wasn't to ask questions. It was to treat him like a problem." Wells opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The younger cop looked at the ground. "You'll be hearing from our legal team," Charles said finally. "Not because we need compensation, but because I want this on record." He turned, climbed back into his car. Jaylen followed. They drove off without a word. Behind them, Wells rubbed his temple. The younger cop finally holstered his taser. Down the block, a curtain moved again. Jaylen sat in the passenger seat, the black SUV gliding smoothly down the tree-lined streets of Maplewood Heights. But the air inside the vehicle was thick. Not with anger, not yet, but with something heavier. A silence between father and son that was less about words and more about weight. Charles Ross kept his eyes on the road, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other tapping rhythmically on the console, a nervous tick that Jaylen hadn't seen in years. The elder Ross was usually a fortress, stoic, strategic, but today, there was a crack in the stone. "I shouldn't have let you go in alone," Charles finally said. Jaylen looked over. "You did, and I'm glad." Charles shot him a quick glance. "Glad?" They showed their hand. "You needed to see it, firsthand." Unfiltered. Charles grunted. "You think I didn't already know?" "You didn't feel it. Not like I did." Jaylen paused. "I've been feeling it my whole life. You just built higher floors to avoid it." That one landed. Charles didn't respond. He pulled the SUV into a nearby parking lot, a shady spot behind a closed bakery with a view of the neighborhood's back entrance. They weren't here to hide, just to breathe. Jaylen exhaled and leaned back in his seat. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't one nosy neighbor or one twitchy cop. It was the system working exactly how it was designed. Protect property. Question presence. Charles stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. "You think I don't know that?" Jalen turned toward him, voice low. I think you forgot what it feels like. You've been behind boardroom doors for 20 years. People don't look at you and see a threat anymore. They see influence, power, money. That didn't come easy, Charles said sharply. You think they handed me any of this? No, Jalen replied, just as firm. But you learned how to walk around it. I'm still walking through it. They sat in silence again, watching the occasional car roll past the gates. It was surreal, Jalen thought, how a place could look so peaceful, so picturesque, yet feel like a loaded gun aimed at your back. Do you know what the cop said to me? Jalen asked. Charles shook his head. He said, You fit the description. Of what? Jalen gave a dry chuckle. Of suspicion. Charles closed his eyes, the muscle in his jaw flexing again. They didn't even run a full check. You could have had a bomb in that van, and they'd still focus on the melanin. That's the point, Jalen said. It's not about safety. It's about comfort. Their comfort. And I make them uncomfortable just by existing in a space they've decided isn't mine. Charles opened the glove box and pulled out a leather folder, company forms, route sheets, driver evaluations. He flipped through the pages, then tossed it onto the dash. I've been monitoring complaints from this zip code for months, he said. Every time a black or brown driver is on shift, the error rate goes up. Lost packages, cancellations, requests for a different delivery window. Jalen nodded. Because it's not about the packages, it's about who's carrying them. Charles sighed. I wanted to believe we were past this, that professionalism, branding, reputation could buffer some of this ugliness. Jalen looked out the window. You raised me to be invisible in public, respectful, prepared, perfect, because you thought that would protect me. Charles didn't argue. He knew it was true. And today, Jalen added, I got pulled out of a marked van with company ID and GPS logs and still nearly ended up face down in a stranger's driveway. So tell me again, how much protection all that polish really buys? Charles sat back. The truth was undeniable. After a long pause, Jalen turned toward him. Let's go back. Charles raised an eyebrow. Back where? To the house. Charles frowned. For what? I want to talk to her. The woman who called the cops. I want to hear what she says when she sees me. Not as the suspicious man on her sidewalk, but as the son of the guy who owns the company she just tried to cancel. Charles hesitated. That won't change her. I know, but it might change the story. They sat with that for a moment. Then, slowly, Charles started the SUV and pulled back onto the road. As they approached 742 Evergreen Terrace again, the same lion statue stared down at them, unimpressed. The street was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace that came from never having to second-guess your presence. Jalen stepped out of the car, this time without a package, just himself. He rang the doorbell. A long pause. Then the door opened. She was there again. The robe was gone, now dressed in casual, expensive yoga attire. She froze when she saw him. Ma'am, Jalen said, voice steady. I'm the one who delivered your package earlier. I just wanted to ask, was it you who called the police? She blinked. I was just being cautious. Because I was cautious too, Jalen replied. I confirmed your address. I wore a uniform. I followed the company route. And still, I got a patrol car and 2 officers like I was breaking in. She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand. I'm not here to argue. I just want you to understand something. I was raised to be excellent, courteous, precise. I carry my father's name on every delivery I make. And still, in your eyes, I was a risk. She looked away, shame flickering behind her eyes. I didn't know. That's the problem, Jalen said softly. You didn't need to know. You just assumed. And those assumptions nearly put my life at risk. A car drove by in the distance. A lawn sprinkler clicked on. "I hope," Jalen added, "the next time you see someone who doesn't look like your neighbor, your first instinct won't be fear, but curiosity. Or, better yet, respect." He turned and walked back to the SUV. Charles didn't say anything as Jalen climbed in. As they pulled away from the curb, the woman stood frozen in the doorway, face flushed, arms limp at her sides. This time, nobody watched from behind curtains. Nobody called again. But the quiet wasn't peace. It was discomfort, awakening, maybe even change. And that was enough for today. 2 days later, Jalen sat at a long oak conference table in the Ross Logistics headquarters. The boardroom overlooked the city, but he wasn't admiring the skyline. Not today. In front of him was a laptop, paused mid-video, the screen still showing the frame where Officer Wells had Jalen by the van, hands flat on the hood, his face half turned toward the camera. The footage was from a nearby house's doorbell camera, anonymously sent to corporate. The angle wasn't perfect, but the tone was undeniable. The stiffness in Jalen's posture, the way the officers circled him, the tension in the air you could almost hear, even through silence. Charles sat at the head of the table, silent, his fingers steepled. Around them were a few key members of the executive team, most of them white, all of them quiet. Jalen hit play again. He didn't flinch when the officer's voice crackled out of the speakers. "Step out of the vehicle, slowly." He let the video run for another 10 seconds before pausing it again. "This is why I went out," Jalen said, not looking at anyone in particular. "Because I wanted you to see this, not just hear about it in a quarterly debrief or read it buried in an HR memo." Someone at the table shifted in their seat. Another cleared his throat. Charles finally spoke. "What do you propose?" Jalen leaned back. "We stop pretending this is isolated." One of the VPs raised an eyebrow. "You mean, what exactly?" Jalen turned to face him. "I mean that this isn't about one cop or one neighbor. It's the entire system. How we train, how we route, how we respond. Our black and brown drivers are risking more just doing their jobs. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we're not protecting them. We're enabling it." A beat of silence passed. Then another. "So, what's the fix?" someone finally asked. Jalen stood up and clicked to the next slide on the presentation he'd prepped the night before. The screen now showed a new program name in bold text: Ross Safe Routes Initiative. Underneath, bullet points began populating the screen. Real-time racial bias tracking from delivery routes. Dedicated rapid response teams for driver incidents. Community accountability partnerships in flagged neighborhoods. Mandatory neighborhood relations training for all drivers and regional supervisors. Anonymous incident reporting system for all field employees. Jalen pointed at the last one. "Because right now, too many of our drivers are scared to speak up, and if they do, they're told to stay calm or avoid conflict, like it's their burden to de-escalate everything." The room was quiet again. But it was a different kind of silence now, one of people realizing they were out of excuses. Charles looked at the list, then at his son, then back to the room. "We implement this," he said flatly, "immediately." No one argued. The next week, Jalen was back in his own apartment, pacing the living room as his phone buzzed nonstop. Messages, emails, interview requests. The doorbell cam footage had leaked. Some neighbor, probably the one who recorded it, had forwarded it to a local news outlet. And from there, it exploded. The headlines came quick. Black delivery driver detained while working. Turns out, he's the CEO's son. Caught on camera, bias in a gated community. When your uniform isn't enough to make you safe. Jalen didn't respond to any of it. He let the video speak for itself, but the messages poured in from everywhere. A driver in Memphis messaged, "Man, this happened to me last month. They said I fit the description. Only difference is, I didn't have your last name." A woman from Chicago wrote, "I showed this to my son. He's 17. He cried. Not because it shocked him, but because it didn't. Even one of the officers from the video, not the aggressive one but the younger rookie, sent a message. I didn't handle it right. I froze. I should have stepped in. I'm sorry." Jalen sat on his couch reading them, a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away, because this wasn't about him anymore. Meanwhile, back in Maplewood Heights, things were changing in awkward, necessary ways. The HOA held an emergency meeting. For the first time in its history, residents were shown footage of one of their own calling the police on an innocent man delivering a box. Some neighbors defended her. She was just being cautious. Others, though, were shaken. One retired schoolteacher said, "If we can't tell the difference between a delivery and a danger, maybe the problem isn't the uniform. Maybe it's us." The woman who made the call didn't show up to the meeting, but her absence said enough. In the following weeks, Maplewood Heights began working with Ross Logistics directly, not because it was good PR, but because they knew they had been seen, exposed, and some of them, at least, didn't want to stay that way. Ross drivers were now greeted by name. Delivery windows were made more flexible. One family even left out thank you notes and bottled water. It was small, but it was something. For Jalen, though, the biggest change wasn't in the neighborhood. It was in the mirror. He'd grown up under the weight of a name that meant something powerful in business circles. But now, it meant something else too. Something raw. Something earned. He hadn't gone looking for attention. But the moment found him. And instead of stepping back, he'd stepped forward. Not just as a son, not just as a delivery driver, but as a man who refused to be silent. Jalen sat across from his grandfather in a backyard that hadn't changed in 30 years. The old man, Walter Ross, was dressed in his usual weekend uniform, pressed khakis, a tucked-in polo, and a cap with the words Korean War Veteran embroidered in gold across the front. His skin was deep brown, lined with age and dignity, and his eyes, though cloudy from cataracts, still burned with intelligence. He sipped sweet tea from a mason jar, one hand resting on the cane that never left his side. Jalen was slouched in a folding chair opposite him, fresh from the whirlwind of media attention, legal calls, and internal company meetings. But here, with Walter, he felt stripped down to nothing but bones and memory. "I saw the video," Walter said finally, voice rough like gravel but steady. "Didn't need sound to know what it meant." Jalen nodded. He didn't say anything. "You handled it better than I would have," Walter added. "Back in my day, we didn't have cameras, just bruises, broken ribs, and neighbors who said, 'Shouldn't have talked back.'" Jalen looked down at the grass. "I didn't want to become a headline." "You didn't become a headline," Walter corrected. "You became a mirror, for all of them. That's more dangerous." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. Jalen finally looked up. "Do you ever get tired of having to explain your existence to people?" Walter let out a soft chuckle. "Boy, I've been explaining my existence since I was 12. When I tried to buy a Coke from the front of the store and ended up with a busted lip." Jalen nodded, eyes flickering with something between sadness and recognition. "But here's the part nobody tells you," Walter continued, leaning forward with effort. "You keep explaining it, not because they deserve your breath, but because there's a kid somewhere who sees how you carry yourself, and they learn how to carry themselves too." Jalen didn't respond right away, but something in him cracked open. It had been 2 weeks since the incident. The company's Ross Safe Routes initiative had launched publicly. Feedback was coming in hot, some supportive, some defensive, all charged. Media outlets kept calling. Civil rights lawyers were circling. And Jalen hadn't had a good night's sleep since it happened, because part of him still heard the officer's voice at night. Step out of the vehicle. Not because it frightened him, but because of how normal it sounded, like background noise in a country that still hadn't outgrown its own shadow. I keep thinking, Jalen said slowly, about how easily that day could have gone sideways. A twitch, a shout, one wrong interpretation. Walter gave a knowing nod. That's the black tax, son. We pay it in advance, with every smile that hides tension, every yes sir when we should be asking questions, every day we walk away instead of speaking up. Jalen clenched his jaw. I didn't ask for this spotlight. None of us ever did, Walter said. But when it finds you, don't flinch. Make sure it shines where it needs to. Jalen stood and walked to the edge of the yard. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the grass. He remembered being a boy here, playing with toy trucks, racing across this same patch of lawn. Back then, the world had seemed so big and so fair. Now he knew better. He turned back to Walter. You ever regret fighting? Pushing back? Walter smiled, showing teeth like worn piano keys. I regret staying quiet longer than I should have. Jalen nodded. That answer landed like a brick in his chest. I keep thinking about my drivers, Jalen said. The ones who go out there every day, knowing they're being judged before they even knock. They're soldiers, Walter said, without armor. But they've got you now. And if you lead them with truth, not just policy, that's how you win wars without bullets. Jalen blinked. That's what this was, wasn't it? Not a single event. A war of moments, of glances, of escalations and assumptions, of being forced to smile when you want to scream, of surviving without being seen. That night, Jalen opened his laptop and wrote something he hadn't planned. An internal memo. Not just for executives, for everyone in the company. Subject: This is not just about me. To the Ross Logistics team, you've seen the footage, you've read the headlines, and many of you have reached out, offering support, concern, and questions. I want to answer one of them clearly. Yes, it was me. Yes, I was profiled while doing my job. Yes, I was treated as a suspect before I was treated as a professional. But this is not just about me. This is about every driver who has ever knocked on a door and been met with fear. Every employee who has smiled through suspicion. Every worker who has de-escalated a situation that should never have existed in the first place. Bias doesn't start with shouting. It starts with whispers, with locked doors, with, I didn't recognize you, with, you look out of place. I refuse to accept a company culture that turns a blind eye to those whispers. We will be better, not just safer, not just compliant, better. Because if we can deliver a package across the country in less than 24 hours, then we can deliver dignity across a city in the same amount of time, starting now. Jalen Ross, VP of Field Operations, Ross Logistics. He hit send. The next morning, over 2,000 responses flooded in. Some were short. Thank you. I've waited years to hear this from the top. Others were longer. I've worked this route in Alabama for 3 years. I've been asked to leave porches, questioned by security guards, even followed once back to the warehouse. And I never said anything because I didn't think it mattered. But now I know it does. Jalen didn't respond to them all. He couldn't. But he read every single one. Weeks passed. The media circus around Jalen's experience slowly faded, but the change it sparked was still rippling through Ross Logistics and through the communities they served. Jalen's initiative, the Ross Safe Routes initiative, gained traction. Other companies, others in his field, began to follow suit. It wasn't immediate, But the conversation was no longer about one delivery gone wrong. It was about what had been wrong all along. Inside the company, training programs were revamped. Every driver had access to mental health resources. Real-time racial bias monitoring was introduced, tracking how drivers were treated, not just by the customers, but by their own colleagues and supervisors. New partnerships formed with community organizations, ensuring that drivers had advocates when things went wrong. And yet, despite all the progress, Jalen knew this was only the beginning. The neighborhood in Maplewood Heights was quieter now, but it was different. Some people greeted him with nods when he passed. Others, who had once crossed to the other side of the street, avoided his eyes. But that was all right. He didn't need them to understand. Not yet. Jalen stood at the window of his apartment one evening, watching the city below, the lights flickering like distant stars. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever would be. But there was power in change. And the ripple had already started. More ripples would follow. Jalen's phone buzzed. A message from one of his drivers in a different city. "I don't feel like I'm invisible anymore. Thank you for showing us how to be seen." He smiled to himself. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was progress. And that was enough for tonight.